Hey everyone, it's Paul here, and it's been a while since I've done a video on this channel, mostly just been caught up with other work and other projects. And one of the things I finished recently was a UK garage album for a library music assignment. And this is really interesting as obviously it kind of took me out of my comfort zone a bit, and I got to explore the genre all the way from classic UK garage through to modern and future. And I guess I landed somewhere in the middle. So that's what I'm going to cover today. It's obviously a little bit different than what I would usually do, but hopefully you can still pick up some useful production and sound design techniques that you can apply to other styles and to your own productions. So for this video, I'm going to recreate a couple of sections from one of the songs on the album. And this particular idea began with a bass line. So I'm going to drag in a Europa synth. And first of all, I'll change the waveform to something in between a triangle and a square wave. Now I want this bass to have a percussive and metallic quality to it, so the first thing I need to do is add a bit more complexity to this layer. I'll engage the first modifier and choose Phase Distort. And you hear that has a kind of pulse width modulation effect. Next I'll increase the amount of modulation from LFO1 and reduce the rate. Next I'll activate Modifier 2, and this time we'll choose Detuning Unison 3. And as I increase the value on this, you'll hear that the sound becomes kind of chaotic and atonal. So really, I just want to strike a balance between the fundamental of the note, but also that kind of rich and complex top end. Now I can take this wave-shaped signal and send it to the spectral filter, which I'll set to Resonator 1. Now if I increase the resonance and then scan through here with the frequency control, you'll hear that it's going to add all of these cool kind of metallic overtones. And I can bring that out even further by using the harmonics processor set to random gain. And again, it's just about finding that balance between the overtones and the fundamental. Next, I'm going to design the amp envelope, and I want this to be kind of short and percussive like I said, so we'll go for something around 400 milliseconds at decay and release, but obviously I can change this as I go along. I also want this patch to be monophonic, so I'll change the key mode to retrigger. Next, I'll route this oscillator to filter 1, and the first thing I'll do is reduce keyboard tracking, as I want the sound to be the same regardless of the MIDI note. And then I'll bring the resting value of the filter cutoff down quite low, and increase the amount of modulation coming from envelope 2. Now in the editor for envelope 2, I can just drag in this first node so that the attack is instant, disable sustain, and then just double click this middle node here to get rid of it as I don't need it. Now for the second layer, again I'm going to go for that kind of hybrid triangle and square wave shape. But this time we'll choose shaping and wrap. Which again you can hear has that nice kind of sharp metallic property to it. Now this time, instead of using LFO1 to modulate the modifier, I'm going to use the same envelope that we used for the filter. And then I can send oscillator 2 to the filter section. And straight away you can hear that's got that kind of very typical garage square wave sound. Now I can add in the first layer again, and I'm also going to put a 1 octave gap between them, so we have this nice kind of stacked effect going on. Now for the third layer, I'm just going to add a little bit more sub and width. So we'll keep this super simple and set it to a saw wave with the unison module on to add some stereo width, and then route all of that to the filter as well. And of course you can balance these 3 oscillators to taste. Now I'm finding that the attack isn't quite as sharp as I'd like it to be, so I'm going to bring that resting value on the frequency cutoff up just a little bit. Now the attack portion I'm pretty happy with, but it's lacking in power and body and sustain. So I could use the built-in effects section that comes in Europa, but I do like to have a little bit more control. So for this I'm going to use the M-Class compressor. And really what I want to do here is just kind of slam that signal so it just draws all the sustain out of the sound. You'll also see down here on the output meter that I'm getting a little bit of clipping. So I'll drag in an M-Class maximizer and then use the limiter with look ahead to prevent any clips or peaks. And Now, of course, with that look ahead function enabled, it is going to add 4 milliseconds of latency as you play. So you can just turn that on and off depending on whether you need to track or not. Now, the last thing I want to do to this sound is add a little bit of reverb before the compressor. So we'll keep the balance fairly low with the shortest possible decay time, and then I'll use the programmer to make the room size smaller. I can also apply some gating to the reverb tail to just get that really tight claustrophobic sound. Lastly, I'm going to use the channel EQ section to just reduce some of that muddiness in the mid-range. So I'll enable E mode, which will let me get higher Q factors, and I can change that by alternating dragging on the parametric band. And then we'll just make a cut somewhere in between 400 and 500 Hertz. Now obviously I can tweak this sound as I go along, but that should do for now. And I should also mention that with that first oscillator, I can use the frequency control and the spectral filter to adjust the character of the attack. So with my patch set up, I'm going to go to the arranger, I'll set the tempo to 130, and then go in for a take. Now normally with this kind of song you would use some degree of swing or shuffle, and I could have recorded this at 16 triplet, but I do find that the effect tends to be a little bit over the top sometimes. So instead I'm going to assign this to groove channel A1, and then in the groove mixer I could just use this shuffle control to control the amount of swing on that groove channel. Next, I'm going to introduce a melodic motif, and a prominent feature in a lot of the more classic garage stuff is the sampled pizzicato string. But in this track, I kind of substituted something a bit more futuristic and spacey. So again, we'll start with Europa. And this is going to be a pretty simple sound. I'll begin by changing the wavetable to pulse width. And then just kind of using that wavetable position to dial in something a bit more narrow and focused. I'll route LFO1 to wavetable position so we get a little bit of pulse width modulation. And I'll set the amp envelope up to be kind of plucky. And then as with the bass, I'm going to route this to the filter section and then increase the amount of modulation from envelope 2. Next, I'm going to turn on the delay module, and I'll turn off tempo sync, increase the effects blend, reduce the feedback, and then just dial in a really short slapback echo effect. Now the next step is to drag in another RV7000 reverb, and this time I'm going to keep the blend at around 50-50 with a really long decay time, and then in the programmer I'm going to up the size of the room to maximum and also change the room shape to number 3 as that's my personal favourite. And the RV is really good for doing this kind of spacey, atmospheric sounds, even more so if you increase the amount of modulation in the reverb tail. I'm going to make this even pluckier by bringing the cutoff down, but increasing the resonance on the filter. So it's got that nice kind of doubled attack portion as you would find in the kind of sampled pizzicato strings, but with a much more modern and futuristic vibe. So again, I'm going to assign this to groove channel A1 and then record that motif. Now, another really common feature in this genre is the use of vocal chops and fragments, and there's a really cool instrument for that by Output called Exhale, which you can also get on the Propellerhead shop as a VST. So I'll change to slice mode, and there was a really cool preset I found, number 71. And I really just like the melody that comes out of that when you play the slices in order. It's also in the wrong key, so I'll use the transpose controls to just bump it up by a semitone. And then again I can switch back to the arranger, set the groove channel, and record. Now I feel like that pluck sound could be a little bit more ethereal and spacey, so I'm going to chuck in the Synapse dual chorus before the reverb, and I'll use a long delay time with quite a heavy feedback, a slow rate, and a high depth. Next, I'm going to start to introduce some percussive elements, and the 909 drum machine is a really kind of staple part of the garage sound. So for that, I'll use the Japbox 909 drum machine. And then in the rack view, I'll just shorten the decay time on that closed hat, so that's really kind of short and choppy. Now, as I come into the main groove, I want a kind of short riser section, maybe 2 to 4 bars. And for that, I'm going to use Europa again. And now I could do this using the modulation envelopes in the synth itself, but I'm going to do this in the arrange window instead using automation. So first of all, I'll begin by choosing a sawtooth wave. And I want the riser to take place over 2 octaves, so I'll set the pitch bend range to 24 semitones. As before, I'll route the oscillator to the filter so that I can control the brightness over time. And I'll also add some tempo sync stereo delay so that as that pitch increases, you get this nice kind of blurred, smeared sound. So I'll alternate click on the filter cutoff and also on the pitch bend wheel. So I'll begin by recording 4 bars of a single note. And then on these automation lanes, I can just draw an upwards ramp that leads to kind of the crescendo at the end of the section. I also think a layer of white noise and a little bit of resonance on the filter would sound good as well. Now again, I'm going to use the RV7000 as an insert, and I'm also going to automate the wet-dry balance of this in time with the riser. So we'll go from more or less completely dry up to fully wet, and then just have that kind of linger for another couple of bars. I also want a classic 909 snare roll at the end of that riser, so I'll create a new lane with numpad 3 and assign it to groove channel A1. Now I only need to do half a bar of that, and then I can just duplicate across the last 2 bars and then join these together. And then in the key editor I can hold Control and alternate to draw an upwards ramp of velocities. I'll I'll add another note lane and also sequence in some crashes. And then as before, just use the compass tool to increase the velocity of the notes. Now I also want the bass patch to change over time as this intro builds. So again, in the rack view, I'll go to my bass and I'll alternate click on the frequency cutoff and also the envelope to modulation depth. And then for this final 2 bars, I'll automate up the brightness of the bass. Now the main section uses the same bass groove, so I can duplicate this from the intro and also reuse those vocal chops as well. Those hi-hats are also going to form the basis of the top loop as well, so I can duplicate those. Now for this section, I want a really bright, lush pad, and a really great rack extension for that is Antidote by Synapse Audio. So I'll set the oscillator count all the way to 12 and increase the stereo spread. And it's a really simple patch, but it's just going to fill that space nicely just by way of the density of the chord. Now I want a little progression here. I was a little bit lazy, I just played the same chord twice, but I can just go into the key edit and nudge them to where I need them to be. I'm also going to select all of these notes and then using the F8 toolbar, I'll just choose side by side so that they're all joined up. Now to add a bit of variation to this, I'll go to the back of the rack where the pitch bend range controls are for Antidote, and I'm going to set the upper range to 1 octave. And then as I did with the riser, I'll alternate click the pitch bend wheel to create an automation lane. And I'm going to move to a quarter note resolution. And just draw in this little 1 octave pitch bend detailing at the end of every 2 bars. Sounds a little bit goofy on its own, but in the context of the rest of the mix, it should work pretty well. In the original idea, I also had some kind of bonobo style tuned percussion going on, and clang that comes with Reason 10 is perfect for that. But I'll just set the amp envelope to have a little bit more of a synthetic sound. And then in that way, I'm just not getting too much note overlap. Now, of course, this needs a drum beat. As I said earlier, I've already got the kind of basic top loop going on there with the 909 hats. For the main drums, I'm going to use the Kong Drum Designer. And then I'll navigate to the drum supply and just find myself a suitably kind of beefy kick. So BD mid compression has a nice kind of impact and thud to it, but also a really bright top end. So I'll drag that onto the first pad. And I'll also use the decay offset to just shorten the sound a bit. Now, garage snares are usually quite high pitched and short, so for this I'm going to use an 808 as a kind of base for the sound. And I'll also layer that with an 808 rim shot as well. So to do that, I could just have this cell selected, press add layer, and then drag in the rim shot underneath. I'm also going to layer in a clap sample just to give it a little bit more snap. Okay, so I'll fast forwarded the process a little bit. You can see I've tidied up the arrangement, color coded my tracks, named them, and just sequenced in that main drum beat. Now obviously I'm working through this a lot quicker than I would usually, and there's plenty more to do in terms of the mix. But one thing that I do want to show you how to do is add some side chaining to that pad from the kick. Now, I used to do this using buses. There's a way easier way to do this in Reason using a rack extension called the pump sidechain and gate effect, and I'm actually going to put this in as a send effect, and you see here that there's a button labeled send mode. And then I'll go to my Kong drum designer, and at the back of the rack I'm going to take the gate output from the kick drum and route it to the gate input of the sidechain. And you should see that what happens every time a kick plays is it's going to trigger that sidechain effect. Now the really cool thing about the pump RE as a send effect is that you can route multiple tracks to the sidechaining effect at varying amounts as well. And I believe it does this by using some kind of phase inverter signal. Not entirely sure how it works, but it's really cool and it's a lot easier than the way I used to do it. So I could take my synth pad track and engage the first send effect, and then just use the send amount to control how much sidechaining is applied. And I'm not sure if anything like that exists in VST format, but certainly as a rack extension, it's one of my most used tools. And of course, there's some other things I could do. The synth pad, for instance, on this variation section that I made while I was paused, I could probably do a little bit of EQing. So I could go to the EQ window and just apply a high pass filter. Now, one other thing that I'd like to happen is for these vocal chops to kind of echo off way into the distance as it transitions into this B section. And to do that, I'm going to use the echo that comes with Reason. So again, we'll go to the insert section for vocal chops. And also you notice that I'm using some of these effects like reverbs and delays as insert effects. And I can hear a few of you out there shouting that they should be send effects, which you're quite right, they should be. But I tend to find that when I'm using these as kind of special effects or spot effects, I like to have them all on one channel. That way I can kind of mute them, drop to absolute silence, and also just save my send effect slots, you know, for when I actually need them to be send effects. So with the echo loaded in, I'm going to change the mode to roll, and you'll hear that initially there's no effect on the sound. So it's this last little fragment here that I want to apply the echo to. So I'm going to alternate and click on the roll, and then in the arranger I'm just going to draw in some new automation, and we'll try kind of fading that in across the length of that last note. And then of course just choose a slightly longer duration, so we'll try 3/8. I'm also going to apply some diffusion to that and increase this LFO amount, which adds a nice stereo effect to the delay, as I really just kind of want this to just disperse and turn into a nice kind of smeared and blurred sound. And then I'm going to use the same trick that I did on the riser, where again I'm using a reverb as an insert, and I'll automate the dry-wet balance and just kind of increase that over time to blur those delays even further. And I also think what would work really well there is to use the side chaining send effect that we used for the synth pad, and also a little bit for those bonobo clangs. So I'm going to automate the on-off status of the send effect, as I don't really want it happening when the vocal chops are dry, but just for this reverb and delay tail. So I'll draw in a block here, and then set the status to on. And then I think lastly for this B section, I'm just going to add some additional percussion in. So for that, I'll use the 808 Jackbox, which is another one of my favorites. And I'm just going to change these toms into congas and tune them to the track. Or tune them as best I can anyway. As you see, the range on this is a little bit limited. And then lastly, I'm going to accent some of those snares with an 808 cymbal. What I'll do for this, however, is I'm going to create a new mix channel. So we'll just drag this in under the 808, and I'll route the cymbal output to the input of the mix channel. And then in here, I'm going to use the echo again. This time set to quarter notes with a kind of 50-50 blend. Actually, I think I want it a bit quicker than that, so we'll set it to 1/8 notes. And I want this to ping pong left and right with each delay. You see as well that, I like to put all of my different drum elements onto different lanes, as this just makes it really easy to kind of restructure my drum tracks at different points in the song. So as I said, this is a lot quicker than I would usually work. There's a lot to do in terms of mixing and also, applying some mastering to this as well. But this should just kind of give you a general idea of how I put together, this particular type of track. As is usually the case with me, I think it's ended up being more spacey and futuristic than anything else. But I guess that's just kind of my thing. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to get around to answering them. And also, if you have any suggestions for other things that you might like to see me cover, then by all means suggest those as well, and hopefully I'll be making some more videos soon. Thanks for watching.